"Daddy will, the bad people really take you away." Those 8 words whispered in the darkness of their tiny apartment shattered David Carter's heart into pieces smaller than dust. His daughter Emma lay curled against his chest, her blonde curls damp with tears, her small fists clutching his worn t-shirt like a lifeline. Outside their window, rain hammered against the glass with the same relentless force that had been pounding his life for the past 6 months. "No, sweetheart," David whispered, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "Daddy's not going anywhere." But as he held his 8-year-old daughter in the suffocating darkness, David Carter knew he was 3 weeks away from losing everything that mattered. 3 weeks away from a courtroom where a judge would decide whether a man who'd never stolen so much as a candy bar deserved 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 3 weeks away from watching Emma disappear into the foster care system while he rotted behind bars for stealing $52,000 from Morrison Landscaping. Money he'd never seen. Money he'd never touched. Money that had vanished while he was working 16-hour days just to keep food on their table. This is the story of how one choice on a stormy night would change 3 lives forever. How kindness in the darkest hour would become a beacon of hope. How sometimes the person who saves you is the last person you'd ever expect to meet. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The warehouse smelled like diesel fuel and broken dreams. David's hands were raw from loading truck after truck, his back screaming from lifting boxes that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The digital clock on the loading dock wall glowed an angry red, 11:47 p.m. 14 hours. He'd been on his feet for 14 straight hours because overtime was the only thing standing between Emma and eviction. Carter. The voice of his supervisor, Bobby Martinez, cut through the rumble of conveyor belts. "You're cleared to go. Don't forget to clock out." David wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a dark stain on the company-issued shirt that read, "Hartford Logistics," in faded blue letters. His reflection in the break room mirror showed a man aging too fast. Dark circles under his eyes' stubble because he'd forgotten to shave again. Hair that needed cutting, but barbershops cost money they didn't have. The locker room was empty, except for the ghost of other men's exhaustion. David pulled on his jacket, a brown canvas coat that had belonged to his father, and checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Mrs. Rodriguez, the 65-year-old woman next door who watched Emma when his shifts ran late. No messages, which meant Emma was probably asleep. Safe. Safe for now. David's car, a 1998 Honda Civic with 240,000 miles and an exhaust system held together by hope and electrical tape, coughed to life in the employee parking lot. The radio crackled with static and late-night talk shows he couldn't concentrate on. His mind was stuck in an endless loop, the same thoughts that had been circling for 6 months like vultures over roadkill. $52,000. The number haunted every quiet moment. Rick Morrison, his former boss at Morrison Landscaping, had looked him dead in the eye and accused him of theft. Not just theft embezzlement, a felony that carried a maximum sentence of 5 years in state prison. The evidence is clear. Morrison had said, his voice cold as winter rain. The financial records show multiple transfers from the company account to a personal account registered under your social security number. The bank statements, the email authorizations, even your digital signature. It's all there, David. I trusted you and you stole from me. But David had never opened that account, had never seen those statements, had never signed those authorizations. He'd tried explaining this to Detective Sarah Renfold, to his public defender James Walsh, to anyone who would listen. But explaining innocence was like trying to hold water in his bare hands. It just slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but empty palms and desperate words. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass as David turned onto Highway 95. Rain fell in sheets so thick his headlights barely cut through the darkness. This was the kind of storm that made smart people stay home. But David had learned long ago that he didn't have the luxury of being smart. He had the luxury of being necessary. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks he'd sit in Suffolk County Superior Court wearing a borrowed suit while 12 strangers decided his fate. James Walsh, his overworked public defender, had been honest about their chances. "The evidence looks bad," David Walsh had said, his kind eyes filled with the sympathy David had grown to hate. "I believe you're innocent, but proving it won't be easy. Morrison's lawyers are good. They've built a solid case, and the prosecution is confident. If we can't find something to discredit their evidence, you're looking at the maximum sentence. 5 years. 5 years of missing Emma's childhood. 5 years of not being there when she had nightmares, when she needed help with homework, when she took her first steps toward becoming the amazing woman David knew she'd become. 5 years of watching her grow up through prison glass during visiting hours that never lasted long enough. If she even got visiting hours. If the state decided she was better off with a foster family who wouldn't bring her to see her criminal father. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white in the green glow of the dashboard lights. The fear was a living thing in his chest, feeding on every quiet moment, growing stronger every time he looked at Emma's trusting face and remembered that he might not be there to protect her much longer. His ex-wife Laura had left when Emma was 2, disappearing one Tuesday morning while David was at work. No warning, no fight. Just a note on the kitchen table written in her careful handwriting. "I wasn't born for this life. I'm sorry." 6 years of single parenthood. 6 years of learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and attending parent-teacher conferences alone. 6 years of being everything Emma needed because she was everything he had. The red tail lights ahead of him suddenly grew brighter. David's foot found the brake as traffic slowed to a crawl. Through the rain-blurred windshield he could see the problem. A car was pulled over on the shoulder hazard lights, blinking like a distress signal in the darkness. A silver BMW sedan, the kind that cost more than David made in 2 years, sat tilted at an angle that suggested trouble. As he drove closer, David could see a figure standing beside the driver's door. A woman in what looked like a dress, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. David's first instinct was to keep driving. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and the last thing he needed was to get involved in someone else's problems, especially someone who could afford a BMW and probably had roadside assistance insurance and all the safety nets that money could buy. But something made him slow down. Maybe it was the way she was standing there, so still and small against the vast darkness. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's voice, clear as if she were sitting in the passenger seat beside him. "The real measure of a man isn't who he is when everything's going right, David. It's who he is when life is falling apart, when helping someone else is the last thing you want to do, but you do it anyway. That's when character shows." His mother had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer had taken her quick and merciless 8 months from diagnosis to the funeral David still had nightmares about. But her words remained echoing in the quiet spaces of his heart when the world felt too heavy to carry. David pulled over behind the BMW, his hazard lights joining hers in painting the rain orange and red. He sat there for a moment, engine running, watching the woman through his windshield. She hadn't turned around yet, hadn't acknowledged his presence. For all she knew, he could be anyone. A good Samaritan, or something worse. The rain was coming down harder now, each drop hitting his windshield like a tiny fist. David could see the woman shivering, could see how the wind was whipping her hair around her face. Whatever had happened to her car, she was stranded and alone in the kind of storm that could turn deadly without warning. Character shows when life falls apart. David turned off his engine and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical blow, soaking through his jacket in seconds and running down his face in streams. The wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and something floral perfume maybe that seemed out of place on a highway in the middle of nowhere. Mom David called, keeping his distance so she could see his hands, so she wouldn't feel trapped. "Are you all right? Car trouble?" The woman turned around slowly, and David's breath caught in his throat. Even through the curtain of rain, even in the harsh glare of hazard lights, she was stunning. Blonde hair darkened by the storm-pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness, and eyes that held a depth David hadn't expected. She was wearing a red dress, elegant and expensive, the kind women wore to charity galas and important dinners. The kind of dress that cost more than David's monthly rent. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his work clothes, his old jacket, the exhaustion written across his face. David could see the calculation in her eyes, the careful assessment women learned to make when they found themselves alone with strange men in isolated places. "It stalled," she said finally, her voice carrying despite the storm. There was something in her tone, a controlled calm that spoke of authority. This was someone used to being listened to, used to being in command. "It just died, and now it won't start again." "Would you mind if I took a look?" David asked, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. "I'm no professional, but I've kept enough old cars running to know a few tricks. Might be something simple." Another moment of hesitation. Then she nodded, stepping back to give him access to the hood. "I'd appreciate it. I'm Caroline, by the way." "David," he replied, already moving toward the front of the BMW. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Caroline popped the hood, and David leaned over the engine bay, rain hammering against his back as he squinted at the mechanical maze beneath. It was a beautiful car, well-maintained and expensive, but machines were machines whether they cost $20,000 or $60,000. They all broke down eventually. His fingers, stiff from cold and warehouse work, traced the wires and connections by feel more than sight. Years of keeping his own car alive had taught him the basics. Battery alternator fuel pump spark plugs. Most problems were simpler than people thought. Within minutes he found it. The positive battery terminal was loose, probably shaken free by a pothole, or just normal wear. The connection was corroded green buildup, preventing proper contact. An easy fix if you had the right tools. "Your positive terminal's loose," David called over the roar of rain and passing traffic. "Probably got shaken loose by road vibration." "Do you have a toolkit?" "No," Caroline called back. "I don't think so." David jogged back to his Honda rain streaming down his face and grabbed his toolbox from the trunk. It was his father's toolbox, battered and scarred from decades of use, filled with tools that had built houses and fixed cars and put food on tables. The kind of tools that told stories about honest work and calloused hands. As he worked to tighten the connection and scrape away the corrosion, David found himself talking. Maybe it was the rhythm of familiar work, or maybe it was the strange intimacy of helping a stranger in the storm. But words came easier than they had in months. "This battery's getting close to dead," he said, his fingers working steadily, despite the cold. "You should probably replace it soon. There's a gas station about 2 miles up the highway. They sell them there, and most places will install it for free if you ask nice." He could feel Caroline watching him work, could sense her presence even through the rain and darkness. There was something about her that intrigued him. A combination of vulnerability and strength that reminded him of Emma when she was scared, but trying to be brave. The connection clicked into place with a satisfying snap. David straightened up, wiping rain from his eyes. "Try it now." Caroline slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The BMW's engine roared to life, immediately headlights cutting through the storm like beacons of hope. Relief washed over her face, visible even through the rain-streaked windshield. She rolled down the window, and David could see her clearly now. Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Intelligent eyes that missed nothing. a mouth that looked like it was used to making important decisions. This was someone who mattered in the world, someone whose absence would be noticed. "How much do I owe you?" Caroline asked, already reaching for what David assumed was an expensive purse. "Nothing," David said, stepping back toward his own car. "Just glad I could help." "Wait," Caroline called after him. "At least tell me your name so I can thank the right person." David paused at his car door, rain dripping from his jacket onto the asphalt. For a moment their eyes met across the distance between their worlds. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, but connected by this moment of kindness in the storm. "David," he said simply. Then, because he was too tired for caution, and too worn down by life to care about consequences, he added, "David Carter." "Thank you, David Carter." Caroline said, her voice warm despite the cold rain. "You may have saved my whole night." "If only you knew," David thought, as he climbed into his Honda and watched her pull away, taillights disappearing into the darkness. "If only you knew you just got help from a man the whole world thinks is a thief." He drove home through streets empty, except for the rain, not knowing that in 3 weeks he'd see Caroline Hayes again. Not knowing that the elegant woman in the red dress would be wearing a black robe and holding a wooden gavel that could destroy his life or set him free. Not knowing that sometimes the universe puts people in your path exactly when you need them most, even when you're too broken to recognize a miracle when it stops to help you in the rain. The eviction notice was salmon-colored, as if the pale pink paper could somehow soften the blow of homelessness. David stared at it through the kitchen window of their cramped apartment, watching the wind press it flat against the glass like an accusation. 30 days. They had 30 days to find $800 for back rent, or Emma would be sleeping in his car, if he still had a car by then, if he wasn't already in prison. Daddy Emma's voice drifted from the living room where she sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by crayons and drawing paper. "Can you help me spell innocent?" The word hit David like a physical blow. He turned away from the window, leaving the eviction notice pressed against the glass like a pink reminder of how far his life had fallen. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Emma held up her latest creation, a stick figure drawing of a man in an orange jumpsuit standing behind black bars. Above the drawing, in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "My daddy is," and left a blank space where the word innocent should go. David's throat closed up tight. He knelt beside his daughter, his voice barely a whisper. "Emma, baby, why are you drawing pictures like this, Mrs.?" Rodriguez explained about court. Emma said matter-of-factly, not looking up from her crayon box. She said, "Some people think you took money that wasn't yours, but you didn't." She said the judge has to decide if you're innocent or guilty. Emma's blue eyes, so much like her mother's, looked up at him with devastating trust. "You are innocent, right, Daddy?" "Yes, baby, I am." "Then why do you look so scared? Because sometimes innocent people go to prison anyway." David thought. "Because the world isn't fair and justice costs more money than we have, and in 18 days a judge I've never met will decide whether you grow up with a father or without one." Instead, he said, "Sometimes grown-ups worry about things even when they know everything will be okay." Emma nodded seriously, then added purple bars to her stick-figure prison. "Mrs. Rodriguez says judges are supposed to be fair. Like superheroes, but with hammers instead of capes. If only it were that simple." David's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. James Walsh, his public defender. David's stomach clenched as he answered. "David, it's James. I need to see you this afternoon. Something's come up." The something that had come up was Rick Morrison's legal team. 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits sitting around a conference table in downtown Boston, like sharks circling wounded prey. David sat beside James Walsh in the sterile conference room, feeling underdressed and outgunned in his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt Emma had helped him pick out. "My client is prepared to be reasonable," said Morrison's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Bradford Pierce, whose watch probably cost more than David's car. "Mr. Morrison understands this situation is difficult for everyone involved. He's willing to recommend a reduced sentence if Mr. Carter pleads guilty and makes full restitution." Reduced to what James asked. 2 years, plus complete repayment of the $52,000, plus interest and penalties. Call it $60,000 total. David felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't have $60,000. I don't have $60. Pierce smiled cold and predatory. "Then you'll have plenty of time to think about how to find it. The state has an excellent work program for inmates. Very character-building." "My client maintains his innocence," James said firmly. "We're not interested in a plea deal." "Your choice," Pierce replied, sliding a folder across the table. "But I'd recommend reviewing the evidence we'll be presenting. Bank records, email authorizations, digital signatures. It's all there, Mr. Carter. Every transfer, every authorization, time-stamped and authenticated. The jury won't take long to reach a verdict." David opened the folder with trembling hands. Page after page of financial documents, screen captures of bank transactions, printed emails with his name in the from field. It looked damning because it was meant to look damning. Rick Morrison had spent months crafting this fiction, and he'd done it well. The worst part was the signature. His signature, or something so close to his signature that even David had to look twice to spot the differences. The loop in the D was slightly off. The tail of the R in Carter was too short. But who would notice such subtle differences? Who would care? "This is all fake," David said, quietly. "I never sent these emails. I never signed these authorizations. I don't even have online banking." "Of course you don't," Pierce replied smoothly. "You had it closed after the investigation began. Very convenient." As they walked out of the law office, James Walsh looked as defeated as David felt. "I'm sorry," he said as they stood on the courthouse steps. "I know you're innocent, David. I can feel it in my bones. But feeling it and proving it are two different things." "What are our chances?" David asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "With Judge Morton, 20%. Maybe less. He's tough on white-collar crime, and he trusts prosecutors. If we had more time, more resources, maybe we could find something to discredit their evidence. But with the trial starting in 2 weeks..." James didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That evening, David sat at their tiny kitchen table helping Emma with her homework, while the eviction notice fluttered against the window like a trapped bird. Emma was working on a math worksheet, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she carefully wrote numbers in neat rows. "Daddy, what's embezzlement?" David's pencil stopped moving. "Where did you hear that word, Tommy Martinez, at school? His dad works with your old boss. He said you're going to jail for embezzlement." Emma looked up from her worksheet, eyes wide with confusion. "What does it mean?" David closed his eyes, searching for words that would make sense to an 8-year-old. "It means stealing money from the place where you work." "But you didn't do that." "No, I didn't." "Then why do people think you did?" "How do you explain institutional corruption to a 3rd grader? How do you tell your daughter that sometimes bad people win because they have more money and better lawyers and no conscience to slow them down?" "Sometimes people make mistakes," David said, finally. "Sometimes they think someone did something wrong when they really didn't." Emma nodded solemnly, then returned to her math. But David could see the worry in her small shoulders, the way she hunched over her homework like she was trying to make herself invisible. His baby girl was learning to carry fear, and it was breaking his heart. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2, David stood at their living room window, watching the neighborhood settle into darkness. Porch lights flickered on like small beacons of hope. Normal families settling into normal routines behind windows glowing with warm yellow light. He thought about Caroline, the woman from the storm. She was probably home now in some expensive house, safe and warm, completely unaware that the man who'd fixed her car was about to lose everything that mattered. David wondered what she'd think if she knew. Would she still be grateful? Or would she assume, like everyone else, that where there's smoke, there's fire? The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez's number. David. I'm sorry to call so late, but Emma's crying. She had another nightmare about men in uniforms taking you away. She won't calm down. She needs to hear your voice. David's heart clenched. He'd been having the same nightmare. 3 blocks away in a house she could afford because she'd been careful with her prosecutor's salary, and smart with her investments. Caroline Hayes sat in her study, reviewing case files. The rain had stopped, but she could still hear it in her memory, still feel the chill of being stranded and helpless on a dark highway. She thought about the man who'd stopped to help her, David Carter. There had been something in his eyes, a depth of character that impressed her more than any of the powerful men who usually crossed her path. He'd refused her money, fixed her car with old tools and gentle competence, then disappeared into the storm like some kind of guardian angel. Caroline pulled up the court's electronic filing window on her laptop, scrolling through the docket for the coming weeks. A full calendar of cases, each one representing someone's life hanging in the balance. Drug possession, domestic violence, theft, fraud. The routine parade of human misery that filled her days and haunted her nights. Her finger paused on one entry. Commonwealth ver David Carter. Embezzlement. $52,000. Trial scheduled for 2 weeks from Monday. Caroline stared at the name on her screen, her pulse quickening. It couldn't be the same David Carter. It was a common name. There must be hundreds of David Carters in the Boston area. But something cold and sharp was forming in her stomach as she clicked on the case file. David Carter, 35 years old. Employed at Hartford Logistics. Single father of 1 daughter, Emma Carter, age 8. The defendant's address was in the same part of town where Caroline had broken down. The same area where a kind stranger had stopped in the rain to help her. Caroline's hands trembled as she scrolled through the case details. Embezzlement charges filed by Morrison Landscaping. The defendant had worked there for 4 years before the alleged theft. No prior criminal record. Character references from neighbors and co-workers. A man who'd never been in trouble before suddenly accused of stealing $52,000. She clicked on the evidence file, her prosecutor's eye automatically evaluating the case. Bank records, email authorizations, digital signatures. It all looked solid, professional, damning. But Caroline had spent 6 years building cases like this. She knew what good evidence looked like, and she also knew what manufactured evidence looked like. This felt manufactured. Caroline leaned back in her leather chair, her mind racing. The David Carter who'd fixed her car in the storm hadn't seemed like a thief. He'd seemed like a man struggling under enormous pressure, exhausted and worried, but fundamentally decent. The kind of man who stopped to help strangers and refused payment for his kindness. The kind of man who might be innocent of the charges against him. Caroline closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the city lights scattered like fallen stars across the darkness. Tomorrow she'd receive the official case assignment. Judge Harold Morton was supposed to handle this trial, but he'd been complaining about his workload lately. If he decided to pass it off to another judge, if the case ended up on her docket, Caroline would face an impossible choice. She knew David Carter outside the courtroom. She had a personal connection to him, however brief. Judicial ethics demanded she recuse herself immediately and let another judge handle the trial. But Judge Morton had a conviction rate that made prosecutors smile and defense attorneys weep. He was efficient, decisive, and completely indifferent to the human cost of his decisions. If David Carter was innocent, Morton would never notice. He'd see the evidence, trust the prosecution, and sentence a good man to 5 years in prison. Caroline pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her window, watching her breath fog the surface. Sometimes justice required making choices that bent the rules. Sometimes protecting the innocent meant risking everything you'd worked for. She thought about Emma Carter, the 8-year-old daughter who would lose her father if this case went wrong. She thought about David's gentle hands fixing her car in the rain, his refusal to take money. He clearly needed his tired eyes that held more integrity than most of the powerful men she dealt with every day. Sometimes the person who saved you was the one who needed saving in return. Caroline made her decision, though she wouldn't fully understand its consequences until she walked into that courtroom and saw the recognition dawn in David Carter's eyes. The Suffolk County Superior Court smelled like old wood and broken promises. David Carter sat in the defendant's chair wearing a suit James Walsh had borrowed from his brother-in-law, the sleeves too long and the shoulders too tight. His hands were folded on the polished table, but they wouldn't stop trembling. Behind him, the gallery was half full. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row, her weathered hands clutching a rosary and Emma's latest drawing. Emma herself was at school, safely away from whatever happened here today. David had kissed her goodbye that morning, memorizing the feel of her small arms around his neck, just in case it was the last normal moment they'd ever share. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. The Honorable Judge Caroline Hayes presiding. The courtroom rustled to its feet like a congregation at prayer. David stood on unsteady legs, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. The moment that would determine whether he tucked Emma into bed tonight or began counting down 5 years of prison meals and supervised visits. The judge entered through the side door, her black robe billowing with each step. She was composed, authoritative, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who held life and death in her hands. She took her seat behind the bench, opened her files, and looked up at the courtroom with professional detachment. David's world stopped. The woman behind the bench was blonde, beautiful, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. A face he'd seen once before, rain-soaked and grateful, beside a broken-down BMW on Highway 95. It was her, Caroline. The woman he'd helped in the storm was the judge who would decide his fate. David's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He gripped the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles white, his mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. What were the odds? In a city of millions, what cosmic joke had put the woman from the highway behind the bench with the power to send him to prison? Caroline's eyes swept the courtroom with practiced neutrality, taking in the prosecutor, the defense table, the scattered gallery. When her gaze fell on David, there was no flicker of recognition, no pause, no acknowledgement that they'd ever met before. But David saw it. In the fraction of a second before she looked away, he saw the moment of shock, the careful control that slammed down like a mask. She knew exactly who he was. "Please be seated," Judge Hayes said, her voice steady and professional. "We're here today for the case of Commonwealth versus David Carter. Will counsel please state their names for the record?" The prosecutor, a thin man named Andrew Collins, stood first. "Andrew Collins for the Commonwealth, Your Honor." James Walsh struggled to his feet, still stunned by the courtroom's grandeur. "James Walsh for the defense, Your Honor." "Thank you," Caroline said, making notes in her file. "Mr. Collins, you may begin with your opening statement." As Collins launched into his presentation, painting David as a desperate man who'd stolen from his employer to pay mounting bills, David couldn't take his eyes off Caroline. She sat perfectly still behind the bench, her face a mask of judicial neutrality, giving no sign that the man on trial had ever touched her life. But she remembered. David was certain of it. The question was what she planned to do about it. In her chambers during the lunch recess, Caroline sat with her head in her hands, fighting the worst crisis of conscience she'd ever faced. Her law degree hung on the wall beside certificates and awards accumulated over a decade of service to justice. All of it meaningless now, eclipsed by the impossible situation unfolding in her courtroom. She remembered everything about that night. David's gentle hands working on her car engine. His refusal to take money he clearly needed. The quiet entirety in his voice when he'd given her his name and disappeared into the storm like some kind of guardian angel. The man who'd saved her was innocent. Caroline knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name. David Carter was many things, exhausted, worried, struggling, but he wasn't a thief. The evidence against him was impressive, professional, and completely fraudulent. Caroline had spent 6 years as a prosecutor. She knew manufactured evidence when she saw it, knew the telltale signs of a frame-up. The bank records were too perfect, the email chains too convenient, the timeline too neat. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to destroy David Carter's life. Caroline stood and walked to her window, looking down at the street where normal people lived, normal lives, unaware that justice was about to choose between law and conscience. She had 2 options, both terrible. She could recuse herself from the case, admit her connection to David, and watch Judge Morton sentence an innocent man to 5 years in prison. Morton was efficient, decisive, and completely trusting of prosecutorial evidence. He'd never look beneath the surface, never question the convenient perfection of the case against David Carter. Or she could stay. Violate every ethical guideline she'd sworn to uphold. Risk her career, her reputation, her life's work. Use her position to protect an innocent man, knowing that discovery would mean the end of everything she'd built. Caroline thought about Emma Carter, the 8-year-old daughter who would lose her father if this trial went wrong. She thought about David's tired eyes, his gentle competence, his refusal to take payment for helping a stranger. She thought about the drawing Mrs. Rodriguez had clutched during opening statements. A stick figure in a judge's robe labeled the nice lady with the magic hammer. Sometimes justice required breaking the rules that protected it. Caroline made her choice. When court reconvened, she listened to Andrew Collins present his evidence with the careful attention of a judge evaluating testimony. But behind her professional mask, she was cataloguing every inconsistency, every convenient coincidence, every piece of evidence that felt too clean to be real. "Your Honor," Collins said, holding up a bank statement, "this clearly shows the defendant's account receiving multiple transfers from Morrison Landscaping's business account. The amounts match exactly with the company's reported losses." "Mr. Collins." Caroline interrupted. "This appears to be a photocopy of a bank statement." "Yes, Your Honor." "The original is Mr. Collins." Caroline's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This court does not accept photocopied financial evidence in felony cases. Where is the original document?" Collins shuffled his papers, clearly surprised by the question. "The original is with the bank, Your Honor. This photocopy is certified." "A certified photocopy is still a photocopy. Mr. Collins. Mr. Walsh, do you have any objections to the admission of this evidence?" "James." Walsh stood quickly, recognizing the gift he'd been given. "Strong objections, Your Honor. The defense requests that all financial evidence be authenticated through forensic examination of original documents." Caroline nodded gravely. "Granted. Mr. Collins, you will provide original documents for all financial evidence, and the court will order independent forensic authentication. We will recess for 2 weeks to allow for proper examination." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through David's bones. He stared at Caroline in shock, hardly believing what had just happened. Forensic authentication would reveal the fraudulent nature of the evidence. It would expose Rick Morrison's lies and prove David's innocence. But as Caroline gathered her files and prepared to leave the bench, she still gave no sign of recognition. To the world, she was simply a thorough judge, demanding proper evidence. Only David caught the momentary softening in her eyes, the almost imperceptible nod that said, "I remember you. I believe in you. I'm going to save you." 2 weeks later, Caroline sat in her chambers reviewing the forensic report, with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just cracked a major case. The digital analysis was damning to Rick Morrison. Every piece of evidence had been manufactured with sophisticated but detectable methods. Bank records, altered emails, forged signatures, copied from legitimate documents, and pasted onto fraudulent authorizations. David Carter hadn't stolen a penny. Rick Morrison had embezzled the money to pay gambling debts, then constructed an elaborate frame-up to avoid prison. It was brilliant, thorough, and completely unraveling under proper scrutiny. Caroline thought about the night on Highway 95, about the exhausted man who'd fixed her car with gentle hands and refused payment for his kindness. Character shows in crisis, her father had always said. When life strips away all pretense, you see who someone really is. David Carter was a good man, a father fighting to protect his daughter, a stranger who helped people in storms. And Caroline Hayes was going to make sure he went home to Emma tonight. When court reconvened, the gallery was packed. Word had spread about the forensic examination, about evidence of fraud and forgery. Reporters filled the back rows, sensing a story. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in her usual spot, clutching Emma's latest drawing, a picture of a judge with angel wings and the words, "She saves daddies." Caroline entered the courtroom with the weight of justice on her shoulders and the forensic report in her hands. She saw David at the defense table, thinner than he'd been 2 weeks ago, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. Behind him, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered what sounded like prayers in Spanish. After careful review of the forensic analysis, Caroline began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "The court finds that the prosecution's entire case is built on fraudulent evidence. Digital examination reveals that bank records have been altered, email communications have been forged, and signature authorizations have been fabricated." The courtroom erupted in whispers, gasps, the scratch of reporters' pens. Andrew Collins sat frozen at the prosecution table, his face the color of ash. Caroline's voice rose above the chaos. Furthermore, the forensic evidence indicates that Richard Morrison, not David Carter, is responsible for the embezzlement in question. "Mr. Carter, all charges against you are dismissed with prejudice." David's hands flew to his face as sobs racked his body. Mrs. Rodriguez cried out in joy, her rosary beads clicking as she clutched them to her heart. James Walsh sat stunned, hardly believing that justice had actually won for once. Furthermore, Caroline continued, her voice cutting through the celebration. "I am ordering the immediate arrest of Richard Morrison on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and perjury. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell for the final time, and David Carter was free. As the courtroom emptied and reporters rushed to file their stories, Caroline remained on the bench, organizing her files with professional efficiency. David stood at the defense table, still shaking from the enormity of what had just happened. Their eyes met across the distance between the bench and the floor. For just a moment, the mask of judicial neutrality slipped, and Caroline Hayes smiled. Not the practiced smile of a public official, but the genuine warmth of a woman who'd kept a promise made in the rain. David nodded once, a gesture of gratitude so profound it needed no words. Then Caroline gathered her files and disappeared into her chambers, leaving David to walk out of that courtroom, a free man ready to go home to his daughter and begin rebuilding the life that had almost been stolen from him. But their story wasn't over. In 2 weeks, he'd see her again, not as a judge in black robes, but as Caroline, the woman who'd risked everything to save a stranger who'd once helped her in a storm. Sometimes the person you save is the one who ends up saving you. Freedom tasted like Mrs. Rodriguez's coffee and sounded like Emma's laughter echoing through their small apartment. David sat at their kitchen table watching his daughter color a new picture while morning sunlight streamed through windows that no longer felt like prison bars. "What are you drawing today, sweetheart?" David asked, savoring the simple pleasure of being present for breakfast, of not rushing off to a warehouse job that barely paid enough to keep them housed. Emma held up her latest creation, a stick figure family standing in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. "This is us when you get a new job," she announced. "And this is our new house. It has a big yard and a dog named Justice." "Justice?" David laughed, the sound still feeling foreign after months of fear. "Where did that name come from? Mrs. Rodriguez says Justice saved you from the bad people. So if we get a dog, we should name him Justice. Then he can protect us from more bad people." David's throat tightened. Even at 8 years old, Emma understood that their safety was fragile, that bad people existed in the world, and sometimes they won. The trial had aged her in ways no child should have to experience. "We're safe now, baby," David said, reaching across the table to squeeze her small hand. "The bad people can't hurt us anymore." "Are you sure?" Emma's blue eyes held too much knowledge for her age. "What if there are more bad people we don't know about yet?" Before David could answer, someone knocked on their apartment door. Emma's body went rigid, her coloring forgotten. The knock came again, authoritative and demanding. "David Carter." "This is Detective Sarah Kenfield, Boston PD. I need to speak with you." Emma grabbed David's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Daddy, are they taking you back?" "No, sweetheart. Remember what Judge Hayes said. All the charges are gone forever. They can't take Daddy anywhere." But as David opened the door to find Detective Kenfield standing in the hallway with another officer, he felt the familiar clench of fear in his stomach. Bad news had been arriving at his door for so long that any unexpected visitor set off alarm bells. "Cinder," Carter Detective Kenfield said, her badge visible in her jacket pocket. "I'm investigating the charges against Richard Morrison. I'd like to ask you some questions about your time at Morrison Landscaping." Relief flooded through David's chest. They weren't here for him. They were here about Rick. Of course, David said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Emma, why don't you go finish your picture in your room?" Emma gathered her crayons protectively, clearly reluctant to leave her father alone with police officers. "It's okay, baby," David assured her. "These are the good police. They're here to help." As Emma reluctantly retreated to her bedroom, Detective Kenfield and her partner, Officer James Morrison. "No relation to Rick," he assured them, quickly settled into David's small living room. "We've arrested Richard Morrison." Detective Kenfield began pulling out a recording device. "The forensic evidence from your trial gave us enough for search warrants. What we found in his office was extensive." She opened a folder filled with documents, photographs, and printed emails. Mr. Morrison had been embezzling from his company for almost 3 years. The $52,000 he accused you of stealing was just the most recent theft. We found evidence of gambling debts, offshore accounts, and a very sophisticated plan to frame you for his crimes. David stared at the documents, seeing his name forged on authorization forms he'd never signed, bank statements for accounts he'd never opened. The scope of Rick's deception was staggering. "How did he do it?" David asked. "Your employment file contained copies of your signature from job applications, tax forms, insurance documents," Officer Morrison explained. "He practiced duplicating your signature for months. The bank account was opened online using your personal information, social security number, mother's maiden name, date of birth. All information he had access to as your employer." Detective Kenfield leaned forward. "The question is why you, Morrison, could have framed any of his employees. What made him choose you specifically?" David thought back to his final weeks at Morrison Landscaping, remembering details that had seemed insignificant at the time. I caught him in the office late one night about a month before I was fired. He said he was catching up on paperwork, but he seemed nervous, kept closing windows on his computer screen when I got close. What else? He started asking personal questions. About my finances, whether Emma's medical bills were expensive, if I was struggling with money. I thought he was being sympathetic, maybe considering me for a raise. David's jaw clenched. He was building a motive, making it believable that I'd steal from him. Detective Kenfield made notes, her expression grim. We're going to need you to testify when Morrison goes to trial. Your story helps establish the pattern of manipulation. What happens to him? He's looking at 8 to 12 years. Embezzlement, fraud, perjury, obstruction of justice. The gambling debts alone were over $200,000. She closed the folder. Mr. Carter, I have to ask, do you have any connection to Judge Caroline Hayes outside of your trial? David's blood turned to ice. What do you mean Judge Hayes took some unusual steps during your trial? Demanding original documents, ordering forensic examination of evidence that most judges would have accepted. It was thorough, more thorough than typical. David's mind raced. How much did they know? How much could they prove? Judge Hayes seemed very concerned with making sure the evidence was authentic. I assumed that's how good judges operate. Detective Kenfield studied his face for a long moment. I suppose it is. Judge Hayes has an excellent reputation. Very ethical, very by the book. The kind of judge who wouldn't let an innocent man go to prison just because the prosecution presented a convincing case. No, David agreed carefully. She wouldn't. After the detectives left, David found Emma in her room, sitting on her bed, with her back pressed against the wall. She'd drawn a new picture while he was talking to the police. A dark, angry scribble in black crayon with the word "scared" written across the top. It's okay, sweetheart, David said, sitting beside her on the small bed. Remember? Those were the good police. They're arresting the man who told lies about Daddy. What if the bad man escapes? He won't. He's going to jail for a long time. Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking with the seriousness she'd developed since the trial began. Daddy, why did the mean man want to hurt you? How do you explain evil to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that some people destroy innocent lives just to save themselves? Sometimes people make very bad choices when they're scared, David said finally. The mean man stole money and knew he'd get in trouble, so he tried to blame Daddy instead. But Judge Hayes stopped him. Yes, she did. Emma smiled for the first time since the police had knocked on their door. I knew the magic hammer would work. That afternoon, David walked to Miller's Hardware 3 blocks from their apartment. Help Wanted sign still hung in the window, and David needed work that would let him start rebuilding their lives. The manager, Tom Miller, was a gruff man in his 60s who'd heard about the trial. You're the Carter fellow, right? The one who got railroaded by Morrison? Yes, sir. Miller studied him for a long moment. My nephew worked for Morrison 2 years ago. Good kid, but Morrison fired him right before Christmas. Said he was stealing tools. Miller shook his head. Kid never stole so much as a candy bar in his life. Makes sense now, knowing what Morrison was really up to. David found himself employed again, stocking shelves and helping customers, at an hourly wage that wouldn't make them rich, but would keep them housed. It was honest work, dignity work, and David attacked it with the enthusiasm of a man given a second chance. 2 weeks into his new job, he was restocking battery terminals in the automotive section when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Excuse me, do you know where I can find the battery terminal cleaners? David turned around, and there she was, not in judicial robes this time, but in jeans and a simple sweater, her blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders. Caroline Hayes looking like any other customer except for the careful way she was watching his reaction. Caroline. David breathed, his hands suddenly unsteady. Hello, David, she said softly. I was hoping we could talk. They walked to the coffee shop next door, finding a corner table away from the lunch crowd. David's hands shook as he stirred sugar into his coffee, still hardly believing she was sitting across from him. "You recognized me," Caroline said. "In the courtroom. I saw it in your eyes when I walked in." "How could I not?" David's voice was rough with emotion. "Your face, your voice. But I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was so desperate for help that I was seeing things that weren't there." Caroline shook her head. "The moment I saw your name on the case file, my coffee mug fell and shattered. I knew exactly who you were, but you couldn't say anything. If I'd acknowledged knowing you, I would have had to recuse myself immediately, and your case would have gone to Judge Morton." Caroline's eyes darkened. "Harold Morton has a 96% conviction rate and very little patience with public defenders. He would have looked at the prosecution's evidence, accepted it at face value, and sentenced you to 5 years. David closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him. "So you risked everything for me." "I broke about 12 ethical guidelines," Caroline admitted. "I used my judicial authority to order forensic examination of evidence, knowing what that examination would reveal. I could lose my position, my law license, everything I've worked for." Why, David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you risk so much for someone you met once?" Caroline leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Because that one meeting told me everything I needed to know about your character. The man who stopped in a storm to help a stranger who used his own tools, who refused payment even though he clearly needed it. That's not someone who steals from others. That's someone with integrity." David felt tears stinging his eyes. "You saved my life. You saved Emma from losing her father. You helped me first," Caroline said softly. "You had every reason to keep driving that night. You were exhausted, worried about your trial, carrying burdens no one should have to bear alone. But you stopped. You showed me something I was afraid the world had lost. What's that pure kindness? Kindness without expectation, without calculation, without reward." Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. "That night on Highway 95, you reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. To protect people like you. To make sure justice means something more than wealth and power." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked across the small table, two people who'd found each other in the storm and recognized something worth saving. "Caroline," David said finally, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she replied with a smile. "There's something else I need to tell you. Richard Morrison's arrest made the front page of the Boston Herald complete with photographs of him being led away in handcuffs and a detailed breakdown of his 3-year embezzlement scheme." David read the article while Emma ate breakfast. Her latest drawing spread beside her cereal bowl, a stick figure in handcuffs labeled "Bad Man in Jail Forever." "Is he really going to jail forever?" Emma asked, looking up from her artistic masterpiece. "A very long time," David confirmed. "Long enough for you to grow up and forget all about him." The article painted a picture of deliberate theft and sophisticated fraud. Rick Morrison had stolen nearly $300,000 over 3 years, funding a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The frame-up of David Carter had been his last desperate attempt to avoid prison, a plan that might have worked if not for Judge Caroline Hayes's insistence on proper evidence authentication. David's phone rang, interrupting his reading. James Walsh, his former public defender, sounded exhausted but triumphant. "David, I wanted you to hear this from me first. Morrison just pled guilty to all charges. 12 years minimum full restitution to all victims. His lawyer advised him that fighting it would only make things worse. 12 years, David repeated, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was still carrying. There's more. The state is offering you a settlement for wrongful prosecution. Not huge, but enough to help you get back on your feet. They want to avoid a civil lawsuit. After hanging up, David sat at their kitchen table watching Emma color while sunlight streamed through windows that finally felt like home again. 12 years. Rick Morrison would be in prison until Emma was 20 years old. Justice delayed, but not denied. The settlement money would help, but more important was the vindication. Official acknowledgement that David Carter was innocent, that he'd been the victim of an elaborate crime rather than the perpetrator of one. His name was cleared, his record expunged, his reputation restored. But the best part was simpler than money or legal victories. The best part was this moment sitting at their table, watching his daughter draw pictures of happy families while morning coffee grew cold in his mug. The ordinary miracle of being present for breakfast. That afternoon, Caroline sat in her judicial chambers, reviewing the Morrison case file, with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice properly served. The forensic evidence had been overwhelming the guilty plea inevitable. Richard Morrison would spend the next dozen years contemplating the cost of his greed. But Caroline's satisfaction was tempered by concern. The investigation into Morrison's crimes had been thorough, and investigators always looked for patterns, connections, anomalies. They'd questioned her decisions during David's trial, her insistence on authenticating evidence that most judges would have accepted. So far, her explanations had held. She was known as a meticulous judge, someone who demanded proper procedure and authentic evidence. Her reputation for ethical behavior was unquestioned. But Caroline knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of professional ruin. A knock on her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Detective Kenfield entered, carrying a thick folder. "Judge Hayes, I wanted to update you on the Morrison investigation. We've wrapped up the evidence collection, and I thought you'd like to know the final scope of his crimes." Caroline gestured to the chair across from her desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Detective. What did you find? 3 years of deliberate embezzlement. Almost $300,000 stolen through falsified invoices, ghost employees, and direct transfers. The Carter frame-up was just the tip of the iceberg." Detective Kenfield opened her folder. "We also found evidence that Morrison was planning to flee the country. He had forged passports, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and airline tickets to Brazil. Planning to disappear and leave Mr. Carter in prison for his crimes?" "Exactly. Your insistence on forensic authentication saved an innocent man and exposed a much larger criminal enterprise." Detective Kenfield studied Caroline's face. "I have to say, Judge Hayes, your handling of the Carter case was exemplary. Some judges might have accepted the prosecution's evidence at face value, especially given how professional it looked." Caroline kept her expression perfectly neutral. "Proper evidence authentication is standard procedure in felony cases, Detective. Any judge should have demanded original documents. Of course, still Mr. Carter was lucky to get such a thorough judge." After Detective Kenfield left, Caroline sat alone in her chambers, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the case files. She'd crossed a line no judge should cross, used her position to protect someone she knew personally, but she'd also exposed a major criminal conspiracy and prevented the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. Sometimes justice required breaking the rules that were supposed to protect it. Caroline's phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Emma wants to know if you'd like to come to dinner Sunday. She's making her famous mac and cheese." Caroline smiled, her first genuine smile in days. She typed back, "I'd be honored." "What time?" David's response came quickly. 6 p.m. Fair warning, Emma's already planning the menu and practicing her hostess skills. "You may be subjected to extensive questioning about your favorite colors and whether you prefer puppies or kittens." Caroline laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the formal walls of her judicial chambers. For months, she'd carried the weight of David's case like a stone in her chest. Now, finally, she could breathe again. Sunday dinner at David's apartment was a revelation in controlled chaos. Emma had indeed planned extensively, creating hand-drawn place cards and a construction paper centerpiece that looked suspiciously like a judge's gavel. The mac and cheese was surprisingly good, and Emma's hostess skills involved a comprehensive interview that covered Caroline's favorite everything. "What's your favorite color?" Emma asked, serving Caroline mac and cheese with the seriousness of a professional caterer. "Blue," Caroline answered. "Like the ocean." "Good choice. Mine's yellow because it's happy." "What's your favorite animal?" "I like horses." Emma paused, considering this. "Horses are okay, but what about dogs? Do you like dogs?" Caroline glanced at David, who was trying not to laugh. "I like dogs very much." "Perfect. Because we're getting a dog named Justice, and he needs to like you too." After dinner, while Emma showed Caroline her extensive art collection, David cleaned dishes in the tiny kitchen. He could hear his daughter's animated chatter from the living room, could see Caroline's genuine engagement with Emma's 8-year-old logic. Watching them together felt natural, right like Caroline belonged in their small apartment with its second-hand furniture and Emma's drawings taped to every wall. "Daddy," Emma called from the living room. "Caroline says she's never seen a real volcano. We should show her our science project." David dried his hands on a dish towel, his heart full in ways he'd forgotten were possible. For months, fear had been his constant companion. Fear of prison. Fear of losing Emma. Fear of a future that held nothing but separation and loss. Now, watching Caroline admire Emma's baking soda volcano with genuine enthusiasm, David felt something he'd almost given up on. Hope. As the evening wound down and Caroline prepared to leave, Emma threw her arms around the judge's waist in a fierce hug. "Will you come back?" Emma asked, her face turned up toward Caroline's with desperate hope. "If you'll have me," Caroline replied, kneeling to meet Emma's eyes. "I'd like that very much." "Good, because I already made you a friendship bracelet and it's really pretty. I used all the best colors." David walked Caroline to her car, the cool evening air carrying the scent of autumn leaves and new possibilities. "Thank you," he said. As they reached her silver BMW, the same car he'd fixed on a stormy highway that now felt like a lifetime ago. For tonight, for everything. Emma hasn't been this happy in months. "Neither have I," Caroline admitted. "David, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "That night on Highway 95, why didn't you ask my name?" David considered the question, thinking back to that stormy encounter. "I guess because it didn't matter. You needed help, I could help, and that was enough. Who you were, what you did, whether I'd ever see you again. None of that changed the fact that you were stranded, and I had jumper cables." Caroline smiled a smile that transformed her entire face. "That's exactly why I knew you were innocent." They stood beside her car for a moment, the distance between them charged with possibility and hope. Finally, Caroline reached up and kissed him a soft kiss that tasted like second chances and answered prayers. "I'll see you soon," she said, climbing into her car. David watched her taillights disappear down the street, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Behind him, Emma's face was pressed against their apartment window, grinning and giving him a thumbs up. Sometimes the stranger you help in a storm becomes the light that guides you home. 3 months after Rick Morrison's conviction, David stood in the children's section of Miller's Hardware, helping a customer choose the right screws for a treehouse project. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and Tom Miller had already hinted at a promotion to assistant manager. Daddy Emma's voice cut through the store's usual quiet bustle. She bounded through the front door like a small tornado, her backpack bouncing wildly behind her. "Guess what happened at school today?" David excused himself from his customer, grinning at his daughter's enthusiasm. "What happened, sweetheart?" Mrs. Peterson said. "I have to do a presentation about someone who inspires me, and I picked Caroline. I'm going to talk about how judges are like superheroes with magic hammers." Emma's eyes shone with excitement. "Can Caroline come to my presentation?" "Please." David's heart squeezed tight. Emma had been asking about Caroline constantly since their dinner 3 weeks ago. When was she coming over again? Could they call her? Did she really like the friendship bracelet? David had been careful not to rush things, not to make promises about relationships that might not develop the way an 8-year-old hoped. "I don't know, Em. Judge Hayes is very busy with important work, but she said she liked my volcano, and she ate all her mac and cheese." Before David could respond, the bell above the store's front door chimed. Caroline walked in looking professional but approachable in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater. Emma spotted her immediately and launched herself across the store like she'd been fired from a cannon. Caroline. Perfect timing. "I need to ask you something super important." Caroline caught Emma in a hug, laughing at the child's boundless energy. "Hello to you too, Emma. What's this important question? Will you come to my school presentation? I'm doing it about you and how you're like a superhero judge who saves innocent people with your magic hammer." Caroline's eyes met David's over Emma's head, and he saw the warmth there, the genuine affection for his daughter that made his chest tight with hope. "I'd be honored," Caroline said solemnly. "When is this presentation?" "Friday at 2 o'clock. And after we could get ice cream, because Daddy says ice cream makes everything better and presentations make me nervous, so ice cream would help." David approached, still amazed by how natural Caroline looked in their world of hardware stores and 8-year-old logic. "You don't have to." "I want to," Caroline interrupted gently. "Emma, I think your presentation sounds wonderful, and ice cream afterward sounds even better." That Friday, Caroline sat in a tiny plastic chair in Emma's 3rd-grade classroom, her knees nearly touching her chin, listening to her daughter present. Judge Caroline Hayes, a real-life superhero. Emma had created a poster board complete with drawings of courthouse and scales of justice along with her famous stick-figure judge, with cape and magic hammer. "Judge Hayes saves innocent people from bad guys," Emma explained to her classmates with the authority of someone who'd witnessed justice firsthand. "She uses special detective skills to find the truth, and then she uses her magic hammer to make the bad people go away. She's like Batman, but with better clothes and a really important job." Caroline had to press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Around the classroom, parents and teachers nodded appreciatively, while Emma fielded questions from her classmates. "Does she really have a magic hammer?" asked Tommy Martinez, whose father had worked with Rick Morrison. "It's called a gavel," Emma explained patiently. "And yes, it's totally magic. One day my daddy was in trouble because a mean man told lies about him, but Judge Hayes used her detective powers to find out the truth, and then she used her magic gavel to make everything fair. Now my daddy is safe, and the mean man is in jail where he belongs." After the presentation, they went to Scoops and Smiles, the ice cream parlor 3 blocks from Emma's school. Caroline ordered mint chocolate chip. David chose coffee with hot fudge, and Emma selected something called Rainbow Explosion that contained approximately 17 different colors and enough sugar to power a small city. "That was an amazing presentation," Caroline said, watching Emma attack her ice cream with the focus of a scientist. "Very thorough research?" Emma beamed, rainbow ice cream smeared around her mouth. "Mrs. Peterson says I might win the prize for best presentation. The prize is a $20 gift card to the bookstore, and I'm going to buy a book about judges so I can learn more about your job." "What do you want to know about being a judge?" Caroline asked. "Everything. How did you get so smart? Do you live in the courthouse? Do you have other magic hammers at home? Do you ever get scared when the bad guys are really bad?" Caroline answered each question seriously, explaining law school and legal procedures, in terms an 8-year-old could understand. David watched them together, his heart expanding with something that felt too big for his chest. Caroline treated Emma's questions with respect, never talking down to her or dismissing her curiosity. As they walked back to David's car, Emma skipping ahead to examine interesting sidewalk cracks. Caroline touched his arm. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What are you doing next Saturday?" "I was thinking maybe we could spend the day together. All of us. Maybe go to the zoo or the children's museum." David felt his pulse quicken. Like a date with Emma. Like a family outing. Caroline corrected softly. "If that's okay. I know it's unconventional, but Emma's part of your life, and I'd like to be part of both your lives if you'll have me." David stopped walking, pulling Caroline to a halt beside him. "Caroline, are you sure about this? Getting involved with someone who has a kid, especially after everything that's happened. It's complicated." Caroline looked ahead to where Emma was crouched on the sidewalk, examining something that had captured her 8-year-old attention. "David, I've spent 3 years sitting behind a bench making decisions that affect families. I'll never really know. Sending people to prison, taking children away from parents, watching families break apart." She turned to meet his eyes. "With you and Emma, I get to help build something instead of tearing it down. That's not complicated. That's precious." Saturday at the Franklin Park Zoo was a revelation in controlled chaos. Emma appointed herself tour guide, leading them from exhibit to exhibit with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every placard and fun fact. She explained to Caroline that gorillas were actually gentle giants, that penguins mated for life, and that elephants never forgot anything important. Just like judges, Emma observed, watching the elephants with scientific interest. "You remember all the important stuff about cases and laws and how to catch bad guys?" Caroline and David exchanged amused glances as Emma continued her educational commentary. Watching her dart between exhibits, her face bright with joy and curiosity. David felt something settle in his chest. This was what childhood should look like. Safe, happy, full of wonder and possibility. During lunch at the zoo's cafe, Emma asked the question David had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Caroline, do you want to be my mom?" Caroline nearly choked on her sandwich. David's face went red and he started to interrupt. "Emma, sweetheart, that's a very big question." "It's okay," Caroline said gently, reaching across the table to take Emma's small hand. "Emma, being a mom is a very special job. It means being there every day, helping with homework, taking care of you when you're sick, reading bedtime stories, and loving you no matter what. It's not something someone can decide quickly." Emma considered this seriously. "But you already do some of those things. You help me with my presentations, and you laugh at my jokes even when they're not very funny, and you eat my mac and cheese even though Daddy makes it better." "Your mac and cheese is delicious," Caroline protested. "It's okay," Emma said magnanimously. "You don't have to lie. But the important thing is you ate it anyway because you love me, right?" Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Emma, I do love you. And you love Daddy too, right? Because he gets that happy look on his face when you're around, and he's been sad for a really long time." David reached for Caroline's other hand, his throat tight with emotion. "Emma, honey." I think Emma continued with 8-year-old wisdom that maybe we could be a family. Not right away because grown-ups like to take their time with important decisions, but maybe someday, if you want to. Caroline squeezed both their hands, her voice thick with tears. "I'd like that very much, Emma. Someday." 6 months later, David stood in Caroline's kitchen, attempting to cook dinner while she helped Emma with a school project about the judicial arrangement. The kitchen was part of Caroline's house, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a yard big enough for the dog Emma still insisted they needed. They'd been taking their time building their relationship slowly, carefully, with Emma's well-being as their primary concern. Dinners together twice a week, weekend outings, family game nights that usually ended with Emma winning at Monopoly through a combination of luck and strategic cuteness. Caroline had been patient with Emma's occasional tests, understanding that a child who'd lost one parent and nearly lost another would be protective of their remaining stability. She'd attended school plays, helped with science fair projects, and learned to French braid hair from YouTube videos when Emma decided Caroline needed to know mom skills. The transformation in Emma had been remarkable. The fearful, anxious child who'd drawn pictures of her father in prison had been replaced by a confident, happy 8-year-old who brought friends home from school and talked constantly about her future plans to become either a judge like Caroline or a veterinarian who specialized in zoo animals. Daddy Emma called from the dining room table where she was working on her project. Caroline says the Constitution has 27 amendments. Is that a lot? That's quite a few. David called back, trying to flip chicken breasts without setting off the smoke alarm again. Caroline, how many laws do you have to remember to be a judge? Thousands, Caroline replied. But the most important ones are about being fair, telling the truth, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. Like how you protected Daddy from the mean man. Exactly like that. David listened to their easy conversation, his heart full in ways he'd never expected. Caroline had kept her promise to Emma about becoming a family. But more than that, she'd become the mother Emma had never had. Not trying to replace anyone, just filling an empty space with love and patience and terrible jokes that made Emma giggle until her stomach hurt. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep with her latest library book, a biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that she insisted on reading, despite being several grade levels above her, David and Caroline sat on the front porch swing, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "I have something to ask you," David said, his voice nervous in a way that made Caroline turn to study his profile in the porch light. "What's that?" David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Caroline's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple diamond ring, elegant and perfect. "Caroline Hayes," David said, sliding off the swing to kneel on the porch boards, "you saved my life in more ways than I can count. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when the whole world thought I was guilty. You loved my daughter like she was your own from the very first day." Tears streamed down Caroline's face as she listened to words she'd dreamed of hearing. "You made us a family," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You made us whole. Will you marry me? Will you let us be yours forever?" "Yes," Caroline whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes." David slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promises and second chances, and home. From upstairs, Emma's sleepy voice drifted through her open bedroom window. "About time I was wondering when you two were finally going to figure it out." They broke apart laughing, and David called up to the window. "Go back to sleep, you little spy. Can we get the dog now, please? Married people need dogs. It's like a rule." Caroline buried her face in David's shoulder, shaking with laughter. "I suppose we should discuss the dog." "We can discuss anything you want," David murmured against her hair. "We have the rest of our lives." 2 years later, Judge Caroline Carter, she'd taken David's name, saying it sounded more approachable than Hayes. Carter sat in her chambers reviewing case files when a knock interrupted her thoughts. David entered carrying a lunch bag and wearing the kind of smile that still made her heart skip. "Delivery from Carter Construction," he announced, setting the bag on her desk. David had been promoted to foreman 6 months ago, leading a crew that was renovating the old courthouse annex. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "What did Emma pack today?" Caroline asked, opening the bag to find her favorite sandwich and a note written in 10-year-old handwriting. Dear Mum, Caroline. The note read, Daddy made your sandwich, but I picked the apple because the red ones are sweeter. Justice says hi. He doesn't really talk, but he wagged his tail when I said your name, so I think that means hi. Love, Emma. P.S. Don't forget we have ice skating tonight. P.P.S. I'm going to beat you this time. Caroline smiled, thinking about their evening plans. Ice skating at the outdoor rink, followed by hot chocolate and Emma's dramatic retelling of her day at school. Normal family activities that had once seemed impossible. Justice, the golden retriever puppy they'd adopted 6 months after the wedding, had indeed become an essential part of their family. He slept at the foot of Emma's bed, supervised David's construction projects from the safety of the truck, and had an unfortunate habit of stealing Caroline's judicial robes when she left them within reach. How's the renovation going? Caroline asked, unpacking her lunch. Ahead of schedule and under budget. Your husband knows what he's doing. David's grin was infectious. Speaking of which, Emma wants to know if she can bring her class for a tour of the courthouse next month. She's doing another presentation about the judicial arrangement. Let me guess. My mom, the judge, how she saves people with her magic gavel close. Why everyone should learn about laws and justice and how my family helps make the world fair. Caroline laughed, shaking her head. That child is going to be a lawyer before she's 15. Or a judge. She's already practicing her gavel technique with a toy hammer. As David prepared to leave, Caroline caught his hand. David, do you ever think about that night? The storm, the broken-down car, how everything might have been different if you'd just kept driving. David leaned down and kissed her forehead. Every day, and every day I'm grateful I stopped. Even though it almost cost me my career. Even though we broke about 12 ethical guidelines getting together, especially because of that. David's eyes grew serious. You risked everything to save me, Caroline. Your reputation, your position, everything you'd worked for. That wasn't about ethics or legal guidelines. That was about love. It was about justice, Caroline corrected softly. Same thing in the end. That evening, Caroline sat in the bleachers at Emma's hockey practice, watching her daughter skate with the fearless determination that characterized everything Emma did. David sat beside her, their hands linked, both of them, wearing the kind of smiles that came from deep contentment. Mom, Caroline. Emma had started calling her after the wedding, a title that meant more to Caroline than Your Honor ever had. Look, I can skate backward now. Caroline waved enthusiastically as Emma demonstrated her new skill with varying degrees of success. At 10, Emma was tall for her age, confident and happy with David's gentle nature, and Caroline's determination to make the world more fair. She'd never known hunger or fear or uncertainty about whether her father would come home. She'd grown up in a house filled with love and laughter, where bedtime stories were a given and Sunday morning pancakes were a sacred ritual, where two parents who'd found each other in the storm made sure she understood that families came in all shapes and sizes, but love was the only thing that really mattered. As they drove home through streets dusted with early snow, Emma chattering about her upcoming school presentation, and whether Justice would be allowed to visit the courthouse, Caroline reflected on how far they'd all come. The scared, exhausted man who'd stopped to help a stranger in the rain had become a successful contractor, a devoted husband, and the kind of father who attended every school event and never missed a bedtime story. The stranded woman in the red dress had learned that justice wasn't always about following rules. Sometimes it was about having the courage to break them, when breaking them saved innocent lives. And the frightened 8-year-old who'd drawn pictures of her father in prison had become a confident 10-year-old who believed the world was fundamentally fair because she'd seen justice work the way it was supposed to. Sometimes the person you save is the one who ends up saving you. Sometimes kindness in the darkest hour becomes a beacon that lights the way home. Sometimes a broken-down car in a storm becomes the first step toward the family you never knew you were looking for. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the magic hammer is real and it works exactly the way it should, protecting the innocent and making sure love wins in the end. David Carter had stopped in the rain because it was the right thing to do. Caroline Hayes had bent the rules because justice mattered more than procedure. Emma Carter had believed in magic hammers and superhero judges because sometimes children understand the most important truths better than adults. Together they'd learned that family isn't always about blood or law or conventional wisdom. Sometimes it's about choice, about showing up, about loving fiercely even when you're scared, about being brave enough to help a stranger, wise enough to risk everything for justice, and open enough to believe that broken things can be made whole again. Their story had begun with rain and kindness, and a single decision to stop instead of drive past. It had been tested by lies and accusations, and the cruel indifference of a structure that didn't always protect the innocent. But it had been saved by courage and integrity, and the radical belief that every person deserved to be seen, believed, and fought for. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story reminds you that kindness always finds its way back to you, that justice is worth fighting for, and that the best families are built on choice and love rather than chance and biology, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to remember that storms pass, that help comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the worst night of your life becomes the first chapter of your greatest happiness. We all have the power to stop in the rain. We all carry a magic hammer. The only question is whether we're brave enough to use it. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and let us know in the comments what acts of kindness have changed your life. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind you the best in humanity is always worth believing in. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the biggest miracle of all.